The recent round of negotiations facilitated by the United States took place under great fanfare in Abu Dhabi in early February 2026. For days, diplomats and advisors from Kyiv, Moscow, and Washington sat together, ostensibly seeking common ground. There were moments of guarded optimism, not least because the talks produced a prisoner exchange involving 314 individuals, the largest such swap in months. But beyond that symbolic gesture, there was no shared roadmap, no joint statement, and no breakthrough on the core issues that have kept this war alive. In diplomatic language, the meeting was described by Ukrainian officials as productive on procedural issues, but inconclusive on substance. Russian representatives, in their own statements, hinted that Ukraine was not ready to engage with what Moscow calls realities on the ground. That phrase carries weight. It suggests demands, ultimatums, and a refusal to budge on positions that have become foundational to each side's war aims. But the absence of smiles or statements of consensus told a deeper truth. Both sides were talking past each other rather than toward genuine compromise. To understand why this impasse matters so deeply, we must first look at the starkly different visions each side brought into the negotiations, and why those visions remain irreconcilable. For Ukraine, the non-negotiables are clear: territorial integrity, sovereignty, and binding security guarantees. Kyiv has repeatedly stated that any peace agreement must include the restoration of its internationally recognized borders. President Volodymyr Zelensky and his government have warned that anything less, anything that legitimizes Russian annexation of Ukrainian land, would reward aggression, undermine international law, and set a dangerous precedent for conflict across the world. Ukraine's demands are not abstract. They are grounded in years of immense suffering. Millions of people displaced, cities leveled by artillery and missile strikes, and families torn apart by violence. Any deal perceived as a surrender would not only be politically explosive at home, it could fracture national unity and weaken Ukraine's resolve. Russia's negotiating stance, by contrast, emerges from a fundamentally different worldview. Moscow approaches this war not as a territorial dispute over specific regions, but as a broader confrontation with Western influence and NATO expansion. From the Kremlin's perspective, the conflict is about securing what it calls its strategic depth, protecting Russian-speaking populations, and curtailing Western military reach on its borders. At the negotiating table, this translates into demands for formal recognition of territorial gains, including control over parts of Donetsk and the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, and limitations on Ukraine's future military alignment. These are not soft requests. They are core conditions that Moscow has repeatedly stated it cannot abandon without losing face domestically and internationally. These positions are not just far apart. They exist in different political realities shaped by history, identity, and geopolitical calculation. And that brings us to the heart of the problem. Diplomacy only works when there is overlapping space for compromise. In this case, that space appears to be shrinking, not expanding. Sources close to the talks reported that discussions repeatedly stalled over sequencing. Ukraine insisted on a ceasefire first, followed by negotiations on territorial and security arrangements. Russia, on the other hand, demanded political agreements be reached before any meaningful halt in fighting. This fundamental disagreement alone was enough to derail progress in Abu Dhabi. Behind the scenes, battlefield dynamics are shaping diplomatic behavior in real time. Neither Kyiv nor Moscow currently feels strategically defeated. Ukraine continues to receive military assistance and intelligence support from Western allies, reinforcing the belief among Ukrainian leaders that endurance will eventually tip the balance in their favor. Russia, despite facing sustained sanctions and mounting economic pressure, has adapted its economy and military production to the conditions of a prolonged conflict. The Kremlin appears confident that it can outlast Western political will, betting that time and attrition may weaken Ukraine's support over the long term. When both sides believe they can still improve their positions through force, diplomacy becomes performance rather than a pathway to peace. And that performance, however careful or calculated, carries enormous consequences. Already, military planners on both sides are adjusting to the growing diplomatic stalemate. Intelligence assessments are shifting. Commanders are sharpening contingency plans. Red lines are hardening. And analysts warn that this inability to find compromise at the negotiating table increases the likelihood of escalation. Not necessarily in dramatic, headline-grabbing offensives, but through gradual intensification. That could mean expanded missile strikes, broader targeting of critical infrastructure, increased use of drones and long-range weapons, and intensified pressure on energy grids. each step raising the risk of miscalculation. Europe is watching these developments with a mix of anxiety and strategic calculation. The continent has already absorbed economic shockwaves from this war, from energy disruptions and inflation to defense spending increases and political polarization. A renewed phase of intensified fighting could further strain European unity, especially as governments face domestic pressure from voters who are increasingly weary of war-related costs and uncertainty. NATO leaders, in turn, are confronted with a delicate balancing act. Support Ukraine decisively without provoking a broader confrontation with a nuclear-armed Russia. This balancing act becomes even more precarious when diplomacy fails and the battlefield gains the upper hand. Beyond Europe, the implications ripple outward. Global markets respond to instability with volatility. Energy prices react sharply to signals of conflict escalation. Food security remains vulnerable, particularly in regions dependent on exports from Eastern Europe. Developing nations already grappling with debt and climate stress feel the indirect impact of a war distant from their borders but close to their livelihoods. And then there is the geopolitical message. Every failed negotiation sends a signal, not just to Ukraine and Russia, but to the wider world. It tests whether international norms still hold weight or whether power ultimately overrides principle. If powerful states cannot find compromise in a conflict of this scale, what hope is there for smaller, less covered struggles in other parts of the world? Some analysts argue that the Abu Dhabi talks were doomed from the start, a diplomatic checkbox rather than a genuine attempt at resolution. In their view, failed talks clarify positions and expose limits, setting the stage for future breakthroughs. Others see a darker interpretation, that these negotiations were never really meant to succeed. They were designed to buy time, probe weaknesses, shape narratives, and position each side favorably in the court of global public opinion. In modern warfare, diplomacy is not separate from strategy. It is part of it. And the aftermath of these talks demonstrates this clearly. As the meetings concluded, statements from both sides were carefully calibrated. No door was fully closed. No final blame was fully assigned. This ambiguity allows leaders to claim reasonableness while preparing for escalation. Escalation, many experts believe, may already be underway. Military activity along key fronts, intensified reconnaissance, and logistical movements suggest preparations for sustained operations. None of this guarantees a sudden turning point, but it does point to a conflict bracing for a long, grinding continuation. The question now is not whether diplomacy failed. It clearly did, but what follows? Does the war settle into a prolonged stalemate defined by attrition and periodic offensives? Does one side attempt a bold escalation to force negotiations on its terms? Or does an external shock, a political change, an economic crisis, or a battlefield surprise shift the calculus? History offers no simple answers. What it does offer, however, are warnings. Wars that drag on without diplomatic breakthroughs tend to become more brutal, not less. As options narrow, leaders take risks they once avoided. Civilian suffering increases. International norms erode. This is why the failure of these talks matters so deeply. It is not just a diplomatic setback. It is a signal that the mechanisms meant to contain violence are weakening at a time when the world can least afford it. Now, a new layer of pressure has emerged. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky revealed that the United States has given Ukraine and Russia a June deadline to reach a peace agreement. The Trump administration is reportedly pushing for a resolution by early summer, with the next round of trilateral talks expected to be held in Miami. Kyiv has confirmed its participation in these upcoming meetings, even as both sides cling to mutually exclusive demands. Why does this matter? Deadlines, especially in diplomacy, are double-edged swords. They can sharpen focus and inject urgency, but they can also entrench positions, forcing leaders toward symbolic concessions rather than substantive compromise. For Kyiv, this deadline offers reassurance that Western engagement remains strong. For Moscow, it presents a timeline that may not align with its strategic assessments. And for the United States, it imposes a political rhythm influenced by domestic considerations, including approaching elections and shifting priorities. The territorial question remains at the heart of the impasse. Russia continues to press for control over the Donbass region and other occupied territories, a condition that Ukraine has repeatedly rejected as unacceptable and unconstitutional. These areas where fighting has been fiercest have become symbols of national identity and sovereignty for Kyiv. Meanwhile, Moscow frames these demands as essential to its security and strategic objectives, leaving little room for compromise. Even the language of peace has become fraught. Discussions over concepts like a free economic zone, neutral status, or referendum-based settlement reflect how deeply complicated any potential deal has become. Ukrainian negotiators have insisted that certain terms, especially those that might legitimize long-term Russian control, are off the table. They have also emphasized the need for robust security guarantees and international monitoring to prevent future aggression. While top leaders grapple with these issues, the violence on the ground tells a stark story. Russian airstrikes continue to target Ukrainian civilian areas and critical infrastructure. A recent attack on Kramatorsk killed at least one civilian and damaged a residential building, reinforcing the brutal truth that war persists even as diplomats meet. Energy infrastructure remains a frequent target, with power grids and plants struck repeatedly, especially during winter conditions, a strategy Kyiv officials describe as an attempt to weaken Ukrainian resilience through hardship. For Ukrainians living near the front lines, every day carries the weight of uncertainty. Some huddle in basements during bombardments, others travel long distances to find food or medical care. Families mourn lost loved ones. Entire communities struggle to rebuild in the shadows of war. This is the human cost that doesn't always make headlines, but it drives the urgency behind Kyiv's refusal to yield on core demands. Meanwhile, the global geopolitical context continues to shift. Western nations are recalibrating their approaches to support, sanctions, and security commitments. Some countries are urging more decisive action to protect international norms. Others are weighing the economic costs of prolonged conflict. For NATO, the challenge remains how to deter Russian aggression without escalating tensions into wider confrontation. And then there are the broader implications for the international system. Every failed negotiation tests faith in multilateral diplomacy. Every collapse of talks becomes a cautionary tale for other global crises. The question looms: if the world's most powerful states cannot resolve a conflict of this scale, what hope is there for the smaller, simmering crises that dot the globe? At Solandos Opinion, we will continue to track these developments, question official narratives, and bring you the deeper context behind the breaking news. Because understanding what happens next in Ukraine, in Europe, and around the world may matter more than ever. If you found this analysis valuable, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. Your support keeps this conversation going. And in a world where peace can never be taken for granted, that understanding is indispensable. Thank you for watching. Stay informed and stay vigilant in seeking the truth.